my name is Joseph Smook. I'm a Richmond District resident. I'm a member of Westside Community Coalition, Richmond District Rising, co-founder of People Power Media, and coordinator of the Race and Equity and All Planning Coalition, which is a citywide coalition of organizations from across the city. Okay, so what's the housing element? I'm just going to go through some of the basics because some of you may have heard of it and some of you may not have. So, yeah, let's just kind of go over some of the basics so that we're all on the same page. So the housing element is literally an element of, or a component of the city's, what's called the city's general plan. And the city's general plan has a number of different that basically help the city to manage on a policy basis how it grows and changes. And each of the elements of our general plan manage different aspects of that growth and change. The housing element in particular is mandated and required by the state of California. And it, of course, establishes the housing policy for the city and the development framework, basically the way that San Francisco is going to be developing housing. And it's updated every 8 years. So the current housing element cycle that we're in right now, I'm going to be referring to that a bit through this presentation. The current housing element cycle ends this year. So it started in 2014, it ends in 2022. The city has been going through a process for the last couple of years to update the housing element in order to be ready for the state's deadlines to put the new housing element in place by January of 2023. And one of the major components of getting that housing element, this policy framework in place, is to do an environmental impact report. And the environmental impact report process takes roughly a year. So they did a bunch of community meetings. There's been a bunch of outreach and hearings and stuff, all to get ready for the environmental impact report process to start. And we'll go over the time frame in a little bit, but that's basically where we're at right now. And the purpose for this discussion is for community members and community organizations to comment on that environmental impact report. So the housing element has a bunch of requirements in terms of how many units the city of San Francisco is mandated to build over this 8-year period. And that is called the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. So basically the Association of Bay Area Governments, which is the last point on here, they've put together this Bay Area plan called Plan Bay Area 2050, which sets out kind of a blueprint for how the whole Bay Area is going to grow from now until 2050. And they've made some job growth projections and other calculations based on state formulas to allocate housing production numbers for each part of the Bay Area region. And San Francisco's allocation, we're going to get into in just a second. So let's go over what these allocations are and kind of how they manifest in real life. So what's happened in the current housing element cycle, which you'll see on the left, again, it's 2014 through this year, 2022. We know exactly how we have done in this last 8-year period based on the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, that's RHNA. So if you look on the top row, the goal that we had for total number of units was 28,869 units. If you read down the column, it says the actual number of units that San Francisco built has been 29,011. So we exceeded the goal that we had by 142 units. So according to the state, we did well. But when you break it down, the regional housing needs allocation is broken down by income categories. And what we see is that in the above moderate income category, which is the highest income category, we overproduced. We were supposed to build 12,536 units, but we built 22,220 units. And then in all of the categories, all of the income categories below the highest one, so everything low to moderate income, we fell short by about a half. So we were supposed to produce or build more than 16,000 units, and we only built roughly 8,000 units. So that's kind of our performance. When you look at the housing element to date, this is what we did in the last 8 years. So upcoming in the proposed this next 8 years that this housing element is responding to, the Association for Bay Area Governments has calculated that we need to build, the city of San Francisco needs to build 82,000 units. So I'll go back here. Our goal for the last 8 years was just short of 29,000 units. And the next housing element cycle, basically what we're going to be talking about tonight, is a goal that's nearly 3 times what we built in the last 8 years. And based on Plan Bay Area 2050, the housing element is responding to a goal of building 150,000 units by 2050. To put that in perspective, as of July of last year, San Francisco has 412,268 units total in the entire city. So what this represents is an increase of 36%. So you may be wondering, do we really need all this housing? So what this shows, and it's kind of hard to read, so I'm going to move on to an analysis of this really quickly. In the housing element itself, they present this chart which shows our housing units and population in San Francisco from 1950 based on every decennial census through 2020. And what it shows is from 1950 to 2020, San Francisco's population increased just shy of 100,000 people. But our housing increased by 140,687 units. That's 1.42 units for every single additional person. We keep hearing that we're not building enough, but based on these statistics, we're building more than enough. And then recently, kind of before the launch of the empty homes tax or vacant homes tax, whatever you want to call it, there was a report that came out that showed that San Francisco, as of this year, has more than 40,000 vacant units. So even if you subtract those out, there's still more than one new unit for every new person that San Francisco has in period. Household incomes have doubled, but housing prices have increased 6-fold. So, as it says on the left, there's plenty of housing, just not enough housing that we can afford. And I will just say this note that that we at People Power Media just produced a documentary that dug deep into the redevelopment activities at Yerba Buena Center back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, started in the 50s. And the argument at that time was that people who were being displaced from Yerba Buena Center had plenty of units to move into. And that was kind of generally known at that time. They demolished thousands of units from Yerba Buena Center. And there were plenty of units for people to move into. Of course, they couldn't afford them. There's all kinds of problems with that. But it was kind of generally known in 1950, there wasn't a, quote, housing crisis like people say there is now. And as we see, we've built plenty of units to cover the increase in population since then. So what these goals basically boil down to is that the city of San Francisco, in order to meet these goals, would need to build roughly 5,000 units a year from now until 2050, which would residents are pretty familiar with over on Sloat. And we would need to build 2,700 westerlies citywide. And what the housing element says is that 70% of this new housing would be market rate and 30% would be below market. The current housing element cycle, so the one that ends this year, had a goal of 57% of the units being affordable. Unfortunately, we failed, as you could see in the previous numbers. We didn't even come close to that. We didn't even get to half of that. And this new housing element doesn't even pretend, it doesn't even set a goal of 57% and fail. It just sets the bar even lower. So is 5,000 units a year a lot? This is another excerpt from the housing element itself, which shows for the last 20 years what our housing production has been annually. And as you might be able to see, it might be a little small. We've never hit 5,000 units in a year, at least not since 2001. And what we're saying is that the market is going to produce 5,000 units a year from now until the year 2050. So what does 5,000 units a year look like? Well, we have literally no idea because it's never happened. So what happens if San Francisco fails to meet the production goals that are established in the housing element? The way that Scott Wiener, our state senator Scott Wiener from San Francisco, has changed state law, it means that if we don't build all of the units, all of these 82,000 units, then we will lose state subsidies for affordable housing. And there will be streamlining of all market rate housing developments, which means no more public hearings or public input for any housing developments that are proposed anywhere in the city. I'll let that sink in for a second. Okay, that was only section number 1. All right, let's move on to section number 2, affordability and equity. Can you afford what they're building? Racial and social equity. So first, this is, according to the city's rhetoric, this is the first housing element to center racial and social equity. But the affordable goal was reduced from 57% to 30%. And the 57% wasn't even cool. So I've had a question as I was building this. It's kind of a common question that always comes up, which is what is affordable? If we're talking about the housing element producing affordable housing, or even concepts of equity, which usually raises the question of what is affordable? What is affordable? So comparing the term affordable kind of generally means generally is responding to a federal standard, which means that you're paying no more than 30% of your income towards your housing expense. Doesn't necessarily happen for everyone, as we know. So what I'm going to do is break this down into like real life experience. So current market rates for rents, and this is based on market research. 1 bedroom, kind of the average market price for a 1 bedroom in San Francisco across all neighborhoods is just shy of $3,000 a month. A 2-bedroom apartment is just shy of $4,000 a month. So when you break that down into what is affordable for a household that is considered low income by HUD standards, which is 80% of what's called the area median income, that breaks down to a single person making just under $78,000 a year, or a couple making just under $89,000 a year. According to the Mayor's Office of Housing, the affordable rent for those households, a 1-bedroom unit would be $2,000 a month. And a 2-bedroom would cost you roughly $2,800 a month. So as you can see, those are below market. They're significantly below market, roughly 30+% below market. And I was asked to make sure to note that there is a ballot measure that the YIMBYs have qualified for the ballot for November that called the Affordable Homes Now measure, which literally is asking voters to streamline housing that would cost $3,648 a month for a 1-bedroom or $4,060 a month for a 2-bedroom, both of which are above market because they're based on 140% of median. So if we can remember that when we talk about affordable housing, what the YIMBYs are trying to do is change the language we use. They're trying to redefine affordable. But if we hold kind of the concept, at least, that affordable is basically 30%, paying 30% of income towards housing expense, and that ultimately needs to be below what the market rate is for housing because the market isn't charging what people can afford. Just one last point on that, just to remind us that median means an equal number of people above and below that line. So noting that 80% of median, these target rents are what most people should be able to be paying because it's 80% of the people who are below that line. Okay, so the housing element, I'm just going to quote this from the housing element itself. The housing element cites a study that concludes about market rate housing that the highest socioeconomic groups move in at higher rates than other groups and move out at lower rates. In other words, the highest socioeconomic groups experience disproportionate benefits of new market rate housing production. So in the new housing element with the 70% market rate and 30% quote affordable, we see that that kind of a strategy is going to benefit generally people in higher income brackets. Okay, so West Side impacts, kind of where is all this new housing and what does this mean for all of us? So what planning is saying in the housing element is that they're targeting most of this new housing for the West Side and for transit corridors. And they call out those transit corridors as being Van Ness, Geary, California, Irving, Judah, what they call, quote, Irving, Judah, Taraval, Park Presidio, 19th Avenue, Ocean, Union Street, which obviously isn't the West Side or a transit corridor, but they're targeting Union Street, Lombard Street, Church Street and West Portal, and then some 500-foot radiuses around Castro and Market, Forest Hill Station, and 19th and Taraval. And this is kind of a map of what that looks like. This is also taken from the housing element, and this is where they're proposing increased heights and increased density. So the blue, it kind of goes from blue of 55 feet up to this kind of red and purple, which gets into the 140 to 300 feet. They're planning for these areas that are colored in. The areas that are gray, they're proposing to decrease the amount of development because there's been so much development concentrated in those areas through the last housing element cycle. So the other part, I think I mentioned streamlining earlier. This concept of streamlining is a way that dinosaurs, or Democrats in name only, are stealing democracy faster than Texas. One of the ways that they're proposing to do this is to create these things called housing sustainability districts, which sounds amazing because it has the word sustainability in it. These are districts that have been enabled by other state laws that basically, the way that they work is once the housing element environmental impact report gets approved, then the Board of Supervisors passes a law to basically enable the housing element. Then the city can create these housing sustainability districts by basically rezoning these areas that are shown colored in yellow or orange on this map. And then once those rezonings are approved, then every development that's increased density in those areas will not be able to be heard in a public hearing. There will be no public input into any of those developments. This says housing sustainability districts will be, new developments will be exempt from public process. Height and density increases will be conferred to developers, and only 20% of the units in these housing sustainability districts will be required to be affordable, which means 80% market rate. So what's next? Okay, so the approval process. So the reason why we needed to hold this meeting tonight, and thank you all for being here, is that on July 12th, which is next Tuesday, comment letters are due on the draft environmental impact report. Then in August, the state of California will be reviewing San Francisco's draft housing element and making comments on it to let the city know whether it's deficient and needs to be revised. And then in January of 2023, the environmental impact report will be approved, and then it will be followed up by a series of Board of Supervisors actions. Okay, so what do we want? So the Race and Equity in All Planning Coalition, which is a citywide coalition, has drafted a comment letter, and the comment letter that we have drafted and that we're presenting this evening and asking hopefully for individuals or organizations to co-sign on to is to demand that the city study an alternative strategy to their approach to the housing element, which would put affordable housing first, real affordable housing first. And what that means is using the EIR process, using this comment process to force the housing element to truly center racial, social, and economic equity, which is what planning says it wants to do, but isn't quite getting there. So the key elements of what is proposed in this letter is for the environmental impact report to study a viable equity alternative that prioritizes affordable housing, that buys affordable housing development sites, and that confers density and heights only for affordable housing, not for market rate. That the housing element not focus just on density, but really focus on density into various neighborhoods, really looking at solutions where affordability and stability are front and center. And to make sure that we retain our community voice. So working with communities on an equity alternative, on actually creating that equity alternative, recommending that planning and the Mayor's Office of Housing work together, which they've never done, and to work with communities to prioritize development sites, to make sure the resources there are there to purchase sites and to move affordable housing developments forward. So that concludes the presentation.
We have a number of questions that we're going to go through. I'm just going to request that if anybody has questions, they still put them in the chat for the time being to make it a little bit easier to track. But let's see, the first question we have is from Ralph. From the 1950s to 2020, has the ratio of persons to housing units stayed about the same, or are residential units housing fewer persons per unit?
That's a good question. I'd have to look back at that figure specifically, but from what I remember is very, very similar.
Okay.
Hey, Joseph, I looked at some of the charts that you sent out.
Yeah.
And in fact, in 1950, the number of units per person is around 0.45. But this last year, the number of units per person is about 0.77. So in the decades, we actually have more housing per unit population than we did in the 1950s.
It's true. I think Ralph's question is getting at number of people per household, though. Is that correct, Ralph?
Yeah, but it's the inverse of Don's point. I mean, the fact that we socially have smaller housing units means we have to create more of them for the same number of people.
I understand what you're getting at. Yeah, and there is a trend right now. It's interesting because back in the day they called them SROs, single room occupancy hotels, residential hotels. Now they're calling it group housing. We're basically building the same kind of housing stock, and we're seeing that there's a lot kind of a trend towards smaller units and the whole micro unit trend and all of that. So, yeah.
So Don asks, what does it mean to be in a housing crisis? A crisis for whom?
Right. I mean, that is the question. I think so. If we get back to the critique of the planning is very clear that density is the answer. They see this as a crisis of supply, and that's something that we've been hearing a lot kind of in the public discourse, is this crisis of supply. But it's pretty obvious that the crisis is a crisis of affordability. The market has no interest in that. The market is producing housing for profit. So the market rate developers are basically that's their motivation, and that's and it's something that planning hasn't quite kind of reconciled. Is this this tendency to want to deregulate the market in order to create greater affordability, but all that does is it allows profit making and speculation to basically rule what we then are able to access as housing choice.
Thank you. Jeff asks, isn't the repercussion for not meeting goals related to the categories? As an example, market versus low to moderate.
So there's a few different consequences. So one is the overall number. So that 82,000 unit number, if that's not met, then the city and county of San Francisco loses out on affordable housing subsidy dollars. So then the streamlining aspect of it, where our voice gets taken away, basically boils down to then those income categories. And that's enabled by a combination of two state bills that Senator Scott Wiener got passed. And basically in combination, what they do is they both increase the amount of units that we have to produce in every income category, which is the 82,000 units kind of broken down into 4 different income categories. And then the second bill says that for any underproduction in any one of those categories, that if a development is proposed for basically one of those categories where development is being underproduced, then that development gets streamlined, which means there's no public participation or no public input into those developments. The problem is that what it's set up, because the goals in each income level, each of the 4 income levels is so high, literally there's no physical possibility for us to meet those goals. There's not enough capital, meaning money to build. There's not enough materials. There's not enough labor, construction workers to be able to build that much. All 4 categories, which is why I just kind of lumped it all together and said that we're just going to have no more public participation in any development proposals going forward, because that's the end result. But you're right, it does literally in the law, it breaks down by income category, but it's kind of moot, and unfortunately.
We would be punished we would be punished for not meeting, like we could greatly exceed the luxury market category and still be punished for affordable housing funding. And then, anyhow,
Yes.
that's a great clarification. Thanks.
Yeah.
I'm going to be asking a follow-up to this, which I'm allowed to do because I'm handling the question, so I'm allowed to cheat. If we've never built the level of housing they've required before and there are repercussions, are they not just setting us up to ensure that we fail, ensure that we'll lose public subsidies and lose access to public comment?
You could draw that conclusion. It's never been stated publicly, but it's certainly set up that way. Yes, I would say that you wouldn't be wrong if you thought that. It was a very deliberate move. It was a two-step move. It was done in 2017 by Senator Wiener, and then he's been following it up with more streamlining and more dense. There's a new one. So yeah.
Lily asks, what incentive do developers have to build moderate housing if their profit margins are slim to none?
That's a great question. So I think one of the things that we saw that gives us an indication recently is the whole discussion around densifying our residentially zoned areas of the city. What was called fourplex, quadplex, multiplex. It was given a bunch of different names, basically taking our single family home and duplex zoned areas and upzoning them so that they can accommodate up to 4 or 6 units. And that was also per state law that Senator Wiener got passed on SB 9. Anyway, one of the things that we saw is that there was this desperate move by politicians to reduce the cost of that housing for the developers in order to induce developers or incentivize developers to build these new quadplexes or duplexes or whatever, basically densifying our residential areas. And when there was a discussion about holding developers accountable to making those units affordable, because the whole debate was around building those units so that we could have more housing that was affordable for middle income, moderate income households, the pushback from developers was so great that it's pretty clear that they don't want to be regulated for price. So if their costs are reduced, they have no interest in passing on that reduction in price, or sorry, that reduction of their price to the tenant or to the purchaser of the units. They have no interest in that. So there's this myth that then kind of propagates around it, which is that somehow there's this kind of equilibrium of supply and demand that's somehow going to, everything's going to fall into balance, and that balance point is going to be something that we all can afford. But then we're told that the cost for developers and land and all the construction costs is too high. So they keep contradicting themselves, but ultimately what it ends up in is the market being deregulated, so it ends up regulating itself. And we see that happening with oil companies right now. We've seen that with pharmaceutical companies. It's basically the same story everywhere. It's just in this case, it revolves around where we can live.
I'm going to make a quick comment to note that we are going to be a comment letter afterwards, and that also note that we have a lot of time dedicated to questions. If you have questions, don't be concerned about time. We got that handled on our end. So building on to what Lily said, Paloma asks, what incentives could developers have, or what might a housing system look like that doesn't rely on profit-driven developers?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. So one of the things that's actually been encouraging, kind of the bright light in the in the darkness here, has been an increasing discussion around what's being called social housing. And it's kind of being called social housing because public housing was such a disaster, but it's basically the same thing. Theoretically, the government has no profit motive. So the government being accountable to the people would theoretically build housing that people actually need. And it's worked in the past, it's worked in other governments around the world. And so that's, I mean, that's basically the answer is kind of sidestepping the market and making sure that we're kind of enabling a system of non-profit driven housing.
Lily asks, wouldn't current homeowners like this? If wealthier people come in, then their property value increases.
Can you ask that again? Sorry.
Oh, it's been asked, would current homeowners like this? If wealthier people come in, then property values increase.
Yeah, it's true. So, okay. So the development doesn't even have to happen. So let's say, for instance, the multiplex program that I was just mentioning, that is, it's on the agenda for the Board of Supervisors right now. Let's say it passes next week, which it could. Once that happens, the owner of a single family home that is sitting on a lot that's zoned for 1 unit, so only 1 unit can be built there. Now it's rezoned by an action of the Board of Supervisors where you could build 4 units there. Your property value automatically goes up. You haven't done anything. It's just an action of the Board of Supervisors. So there's all kinds of kind of self-serving motivations that can be driving a lot of these policies for sure.
Luma asks, what percentage of the Sunset or SF at large is homeowners and what percentage is renters? And Lily does help answer that the Sunset's about 60% homeowners and 40% renters, give or take, but we still don't have an answer right now for SF at large.
It's the reverse, basically for SF at large, it's roughly 60 to 65% renters and the balance homeowners. So 35% or so.
How often do you think does public input actually impact the affordability of housing?
So it's been kind of a common strategy across the city, especially in areas where there's been more kind of large scale development, especially the Mission, Potrero Hill, Soma, Chinatown, where communities have actually had quite a lot of influence and have exacted kind of either impact fees or additional affordable units, deeper levels of affordability, family-sized units, all kinds of things. We've seen a number of concessions from developers. So the public input process and the public approval process has been really important. I mean, it'd be nice if those things were kind of built into the system so we don't have to fight development by development, but it has been a useful tool for communities for many years. And I think it's one of the reasons why politicians like Scott Wiener have been trying to take that away, because yeah, they want for developers just to be able to do what they want to do.
Leslie asks, what are the most effective ways we can bring about the changes that the Rep Coalition wants? What else can we do besides sign this letter? And what do you think our chances are in having impact?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So a couple things. One is if we don't respond, then we don't have a chance. So then I'll respond to like, what is the pathway for having an impact on this process around the housing element? And it's hard to tell, but I'll just relate some of the things that we've been talking about at the Rep Coalition. So, or the Race and Equity in All Planning Coalition. So one of them is to offer up this process that I mentioned, which is planning, the Mayor's Office of Housing and community groups all working together on a plan to create a housing element that actually focuses on equity, actually centers on equity, actually puts affordable housing first, because what they describe, so every environmental impact report has to describe what they call project alternatives. So what I just showed you is what they call their preferred project. This is what planning wants to do, but they have to study all these other project alternatives to give the public an idea of other ways that it could be done, maybe other ways that might have a lesser environmental impact. one of the things that they studied was what they called an equity alternative. That equity alternative literally was described in 2 sentences and was and discarded because of that. So what we're asking for is for a process that's led by communities to create a viable equity alternative. So that's one. Another is we're in discussions with some members of the Board of Supervisors to create a resolution from the board that will point to some expectations from the Board of Supervisors around how to define equity and how to approach the housing element to signal to planning what the Board of Supervisors expects, because the Board of Supervisors ultimately has to pass legislation to basically to implement the housing element. So that's second strategy. Third strategy, which is time consuming and expensive, but ultimately is something that has to be on the table, is litigation. So you can sue the city once it passes the housing, once it passes the environmental impact report or approves the environmental impact report, you can sue the city before the Board of Supervisors takes any action, basically to call out the city for basically misleading the public. I don't know how else to say it. Basically saying that they didn't disclose that there was a viable equity alternative and holding them accountable to it through the courts.
Sandra asks, where does Planning Department and Planning Commission stand on the housing element?
So the Planning Department is a little complicated. This is the housing element that they wrote. We do know that there's a segment of Planning Department staff within the equity division of planning that is interested in looking at this very differently and engaging the public in a different way, but they're not given a leadership role in this process. Then the Planning Commission, there are 7 members of the Planning Commission. 3 tend to be kind of on the progressive side, 4 tend to be on the more conservative side. So that already sets up a 4-3 vote. And one of the more progressive members was involved very closely with the Race and Equity and All Planning Coalition, so has been told by the city attorney that they are not even able to discuss the housing element during public hearing. So we literally only have 6 members of the Planning Commission who can even talk about this. And so the vote will go 4-2 if I'm predicting properly.
Carrie asks, can you review what affordability means in terms of deeply affordable? That is how 30% of income for extremely low income translates to 15 to 25% AMI, as this applies to many extremely low income seniors as well as people with disabilities.
Right. So all those numbers are correct. So one of the safeguards or one of the programs that the city's put in place to make sure that people who % of the area median income income range, that they're able to pay 30% of their income towards their rent is what's called rental subsidies. So there's the senior operating subsidy, there's the local operating subsidy, there are Section 8 subsidies. So all these different programs basically provide, and basically it's they pay kind of the balance between what you as a person can pay that's calculated as 30% of your actual income, no matter how low it is. That program will pay the balance between that and the actual rent that's being charged for the unit.
Liz asks, can you explain what is meant by the term equity alternative?
Yeah, so it's kind of complicated, but every environmental impact report, not just for the housing element, but for any development that's required to do an environmental impact report per the California Environmental Quality Act, they have to study a range of alternatives to what the developer, in this case, the developer is the city, or the project sponsor, I should say, what they define as their preferred project. So what I described earlier and showed the maps of and all of that is what the planning department has described as their preferred project. So they have to study a number of different alternatives in order, so that environmental impact report by law is what's called an informational document. So it's supposed to disclose information to the public. That's its sole purpose. So what it has to do is compare what's being proposed to other options that might create a lesser environmental impact. And one of the alternatives that must be studied is what's called the no project alternative. So assuming that all the conditions that currently exist would carry forward into the future, which means basically the current housing element would, and all the policies around development that we currently have would carry into the future. And the city projects that by 2050, that 100,000 units would be built, or sorry, 102,000 units would be built instead of 150,000 units, if, under the no project alternative. And so what they did was they studied, I think it was 4 different alternatives. One of the ones that had lesser environmental impacts was what they call the preservation alternative. I'm not going to go into the details, but then they also studied some alternatives. I think I mentioned that one of them was an equity alternative, as they described, which would basically create a moratorium on market rate housing and build only 100% affordable housing projects until all of our affordable housing goals are met. And they deemed that as being infeasible. And the way they described it, it was infeasible. It was legally infeasible. It was practically infeasible. But what we're putting forward is a way to approach that equity strategy of building affordable first, or prioritizing affordable first, without creating a moratorium on market rate housing, so without getting into the legal challenges that would be kind of provoked by that kind of a strategy. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. And Joseph's been talking for about an hour. I'm gonna start going through questions a little bit quicker. Steve asked, besides public comments due on July 12th, what are various pressure points that focus on to promote deeply affordable housing?
Ooh, oh boy, that's a big question. Well, I think just in terms of like, maybe I'll just focus on this process, because there's also like the budget process. We were just really successful in the last several weeks for making sure that the Prop I dollars were actually allocated to affordable housing. So, there's a number of different kind of pressure points for making sure that the money gets allocated to affordable housing. And then affordable housing actually gets built. But in terms of this housing element process, the pressure point, I think, really is making sure the comment letter goes in, making sure that we work with the Board of Supervisors to get a resolution passed that hopefully encourages this participation of community groups, Mayor's Office of Housing and Planning, working together to create this equity alternative.
Don asks, why do we need incentives at all to build housing? Why do we not instead use public money to create housing and eliminate profit incentive?
That's a great question. I mean, I would agree. I mean, that's what we should be doing, right? And developers really don't need any incentive at all, because they're making a lot of money. So, and they keep building. I didn't show a map, this particular map, but we have mapped all of the developments, all of the multi-unit developments, I should say, not including single family homes, but but all the multi-unit developments all across the city. And we keep hearing this myth that all the development's happening on the eastern part of the city, but when you look at the map, it's happening everywhere. Like developers don't need any incentives to build, they're building everywhere, like literally all over the city. So yeah, I mean, that is what we need to be moving towards. There's an initiative at the state level right now to really start to prioritize social housing initiatives. There's, the Prop I that passed and then the efforts from the allocation committee that's working on, with the Prop I dollars and making recommendations from that. I know Carrie's been really involved with that committee. Hi, Carrie. Is that, social housing is actually gathering a lot of momentum, which is great. Yes, we don't need incentives for the market, for sure.
Okay, going forward a little bit, it is getting sort of late. Liz asks, I am curious about means testing. How can we make sure that affordable housing units actually go to low income people?
Yes, okay, so this is, I know Liz knows this, and thank you so much, Liz, for asking this question. It's been a huge problem. The Mayor's Office of Housing making sure that the units that are designated for being affordable for certain income targeted ranges, that they're actually implemented for that purpose. The issue here is not with the 100% affordable developments generally, because there's lots of eyes kind of managing those projects, and generally those are mission-based organizations that want to provide affordable housing. Where the problem generally happens is in what's called the below market rate units, or the inclusionary units, where a for-profit developer is providing affordable units. And it is one of the problems with this approach that planning is taking by putting so many eggs into the market rate housing basket, where they're relying so much on market rate developers to provide affordable units, is that they don't want to provide them. And they do all kinds of things. We've seen bait and switch where they get their developments approved and they're like, oh yeah, I can't make the numbers work. I don't want to provide those units actually in my development. I'm going to do them somewhere else, and then they never provide them. That happens. Or they provide them and then they just skirt around the approval system from the Mayor's Office of Housing. It happens all the time. So yeah, it's problematic. Relying on the market to provide affordable housing is incredibly problematic. Absolutely. Not that they shouldn't pay their fair share. I'm not arguing that. But it is like on the ground, day to day, a struggle to make sure that for-profit developers or for-profit landlords actually provide their affordable units to the people who they were supposed to.
I'm gonna try, we're at 8. I'm gonna try to limit this to 5 or so more questions to keep Joseph from fully burning out. Let's see. Jay asks, doesn't there need to be considerations for quality of life along with equity and affordability?
Absolutely. So quality of life, of course, is subjective. What we've been talking about are very objective parameters around affordability, and they're very hard numbers. They relate to your income and all of that. The quality of life issues are really real as well. But I think that that's where you get into this whole concept of taking away our voice, because it's one of the things that people like Scott Wiener are sick of. They don't want us talking about neighborhoods. They don't want us talking about communities and what it's like to live in places where there's tons of market rate housing going. So I'm just going to relate one very interesting data point, which is planning and Supervisor Marr, the District 4 office, have been working for the last several years on the Sunset Forward neighborhood plan. As part of that planning effort, the planning department ran sets of data that just to show kind of what the Sunset is like. And it's extremely interesting to see that in the south of Market, for instance, where there's tons of development, all these huge condo towers going up, that housing prices are increasing at an alarming rate. Oh, thanks, Lily, for putting the link in the chat. When you look at the housing prices in District 4, I know it's been going up and it's concerning to everybody, but it's basically stable, especially when you compare it to other neighborhoods that are experiencing more development. And so you have to ask yourself, like, who is all of this new development for? And is development actually creating affordability? And then what is the quality of our neighborhoods where development's happening, and what kind of development should be happening? And these are the questions that we should be engaging in. And these are the questions, like, I'm not going to sit here and give you an answer, because it's up to people in a community to talk about this stuff. What is the quality of the community? What is people-based planning? Why are we looking at the financial district and saying, oh, it's dying? You know, well, it's not a neighborhood. It's not built around people. It's built around huge businesses. And those businesses, well, they can all work at home now. So yeah, I think a critical question is, how do we get back to people-based planning? How do we talk about communities? And how do we engage people who live in communities to basically have self-determination over how communities are developed? And this is what's being kind of taken out from under us by the powers that be in Sacramento, especially.
There was a question that I think was accidentally directed to just me. Kathy asked, what do we need to ask our supervisor to do?
Right, so shortly, I think the first step is getting this letter in, but we're starting to talk with supervisors about a strategy for having at least one resolution, maybe a series of resolutions to establish some expectations for the housing element, now that it's become much more clear what the housing element actually is, because it wasn't really clear before. So there will be other steps. This is just the beginning of a conversation. So as those resolutions get written, we'll make sure that everybody's aware of them so that you can encourage supervisors, hopefully, to vote for them. And then ultimately, the housing element will be, the EIR will be approved next January, and then the Board of Supervisors will be basically presented with implementing legislation to what's called amend the general plan. It gets kind of technical. So at that point, depending on how far we've been able to get between now and January in terms of shaping what finally is in this project, this housing element, will depend on what we ask supervisors to do. So stay tuned. This is kind of the beginning of a conversation.
I think this is going to be our last question for tonight. Diane asked, can the city sue the state to lower the RHNA goals?
Ooh, so that's a great question. Okay, so the city actually took a position and wrote a fairly strong letter. It was pretty good. The mayor and the Board of Supervisors questioning and pushing back on the RHNA goals on this 82,000 units. And it was actually even lower at that point. It was a little bit lower. And then it was recalculated and it was bumped up. And with the lower number, the city was already pushing back. We asked the city to step up and push back when the Plan Bay area had its environmental impact report up for adoption. And we asked the city to call, along with other cities, to call those numbers into question. And the city of San Francisco did not step up. The mayor's office did not step up. And so at this point, can it litigate against it? There's a statewide group that's been convening advocates about their housing elements. So I could go to that group and ask if anybody in that group knows, because there's a bunch of attorneys in that group and other housing advocates. So it's something that I could ask. I'm not 100% sure.
So I want to thank everyone for coming. We're gonna ask Don and Joseph if there's anything we can do in terms of follow-up. And I do apologize because I am remarkably dehydrated, but I do thank everyone for coming. Don, Joseph.
Oh, am I unmuted here? Okay. Yeah, actually, I would what we have been circulating is a draft letter that we want people to sign onto, and it's actually coming from the Race and Equity in All Planning Coalition. We have reached out to individual organizations in the West Side to raise some issues about this housing element and make some demands about what we want to see in that housing element. I wonder, Joseph, if you could summarize some of those points.
Summarize some of the points that are in the letter?
Yes.
Oh, sure. Yes. So okay. So what the Race and Equity in All Planning Coalition is requesting is that the planning department work with the Mayor's Office of Housing and with community groups to put together an equity alternative, an actual viable equity alternative to the housing element. And generally what happens when you send in your comment letter, literally you don't get any response from planning until a year later. In this case, it would be January of 2023, because that's the schedule. And then they would dump literally 1,500 pages on you, and your comment would be buried in that 1,500 pages, and their little response of yeah, thanks for your question. Moving on. That's literally what it says usually. And so what we're asking for them to do is not to do that, but to actually take this recommendation seriously and start to engage in a process, rather than us kind of getting to the end, telling them they didn't do their job, trying to hold up the process. We're like, no, engage with us now. Let's put together a real equity alternative, and you can meet your state deadline for getting the housing element approved. So that's one of our things. The other is calling out a number of deficiencies. They didn't mention the housing balance as a policy that governs development in the city. They didn't take into account water usage, or something that I see Tomasita put in the chat. They didn't take into consideration the environmental impacts of these higher and denser buildings, which would move us from wood frame construction to concrete and steel construction. There's all kinds of things that are kind of very technical in terms of deficiencies, things they didn't study in the EIR. So those, yeah, I think those are basically the things that are in the letter.
I drank a bunch of water off screen. I want to thank everyone for coming here today. We're going to be closing up a little bit early, but we want to make sure that nobody burns out too much tonight. Thanks again, everyone, for coming out.
Thanks, Matthew, for facilitating. And just to mention, so if organizations, individuals are interested in signing on to the letter, you can email me. I'm going to put my email in the chat. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joseph. Great presentation.
Thanks, Joseph.
Yeah, thank you, Joseph. My camera doesn't work. You're my housing guru.
It's good to hear your voice, Kathy. I can't see you.
Thank you. This is really helpful.
Here, Liz.